The illustrator known as Willy Pogány was born in 1882 as Vilmos András Feichtman in a farming community in Szeged, Hungary. He had early ambitions to become an engineer, but he spent much of his youth drawing and painting, and eventually went on to study art in Munich and then Paris, where he tried and failed to attract any attention to his paintings. In 1903 he changed his surname to Pogány for reasons I've been completely unable to find out, but in that year his first published illustrations appeared in a book of Turkish fairy tales. It featured a series of skillfully executed pen and ink monochromes of considerable sensitivity, and there were also several pages printed with a limited palette of flat colours, which were far heavier and rendered in what looks very much like colour woodcuts. At this time, London was by far the biggest centre for the publication of illustrated books, and Pogány managed to get together enough money to leave Paris for London in the hope of more regular work. He was far from an overnight success, but in 1906 he was commissioned to produce a large volume of monochrome line illustrations for the Welsh Fairy Book by W.J. Thomas, which was published a year later. And the book also featured a watercolour frontispiece which clearly showed his facility with that medium. In 1908 Pogány got married and had two more successful books published. A Treasury of Verse for Little Children contained another series of full-page monochromes, all of which were well composed and featured particularly graceful calligraphic line work. And in this book there were several more highly decorative and atmospheric colour plates rendered with ink and tonal watercolour, which gave the book considerably greater appeal to the young readers and their parents, even if it did raise the price considerably. And perhaps most significantly for his early career, the same year saw the publication of Pogány's remarkable visualisation of Goethe's Faust. This dark moralist tale of a man who sells his soul to the devil could not have been further from the light fantasy tone of his children's work. The book contained a large number of uniformly memorable pen and watercolour wash illustrations, each of them attractively and dramatically composed, with particularly well evoked lighting. And this collection gave a clear indication of the persistence of Pogány's creativity and natural affinity for narrative continuity. This was the start of a period of intense productivity, and among others in 1909 he created both watercolour paintings and simpler line drawings for an edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales. But it was also in that year that his illustrated Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was published, and the inclusion of orientally styled hand lettering and page decoration contributed to making this a milestone in both Pogány's career and the publication of gift books in Britain. Once more his dexterity with watercolours and narrative subjects were harnessed with immense creative success throughout the book. All the images were predominantly scenic, but included smaller figures within the compositions, and the book sold well and was highly regarded among the better off in Britain at the time. The level of his popularity in this market was by the turn of the decade rivalling that of Rackham and Dulac, and in 1910 the collection titled Folk Tales from Many Lands was published, with yet more agreeable formally delineated monochromes and the by now expected atmospheric full-colour pages to accompany the various stories. But as with the previous year's Omar Khayyam, this year's runaway major creative achievement was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This particularly dark epic poem provided Pogány with the perfect opportunity to create a series of dramatic illustrations which were instantly considered to be classics of their kind. As with the Rubaiyat, it wasn't just the illustrations themselves which made this book such a desirable volume. The design of the pages, intricate borders and the palette of colours used in their decoration combined with the narrative work to make this a major creative achievement, and yet another runaway success which set the bar for others to attempt. Obviously not one to rest on his laurels, between 1911 and 1913 Pogány published illustrated editions of the Nordic mythological tales which had been used for the operatic works of the composer Richard Wagner. Tannhauser was the first and set the tone for the whole project, Once more, the reader couldn't fail to be seduced by sympathetically designed page decorations and text, and an abundance of rousing heroic imagery rendered in full colour, limited colour and pure linear monochrome. Parsifal followed a year later with equally irresistible qualities, and the last visualisation of this romantic mythological trilogy, Lohengrin, appeared in 1914. When viewed as an interconnected trilogy, Pogány's visualisation of these tales was every bit as emotionally charged and accomplished as the music which had inspired them. And the apparently limitless graphic variation he brought to this body of engrossing illustration has made it a classic of its kind which endures as one of his greatest achievements. In addition to this monumental and iconic volume of work, he'd even found time for other lesser demanding projects, including retellings of both Robinson Crusoe and Hiawatha, with suitably amended storylines as whimsical picture books, with young children in the eponymous roles in 1914. In that year, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and whether this was the reason I don't know, but Pogány left for the USA. The reputation he had acquired in the previous decade in Britain made this an easy transition, and following his arrival, More Tales from the Arabian Nights was published in 1915. The watercolours he created for this book were every bit as engaging as his earlier successes, and in this instance he seized the opportunity to further enhance the notion of exotically oriental romance offered by the text. But although his settings and costumes spoke of Arabic culture, the majority of his characters, and particularly the females, were patently of Western origin. Pogány's compositional skills were well to the fore in this publication, and he was highly selective about what elements were and were not included. And he took a very similar approach for an equally engrossing collection of colour full-page illustrations of various scenes taken from the Old Testament, in the book Bible Stories to Read and Tell, which was published a year later. I found no references to Pogány's approach to historical research, or for that matter his use of life models to inform his work, but the end results of these projects speaks volumes about his methods. Pogány's illustrations were also featuring in the pages and on the covers of various American mainstream magazines, and his flair for the romantic and exotic was also harnessed frequently for advertising work in a series of colour press ads. And in a run of remarkable productivity, Pogány's illustrations for Padraic Colum's The King of Ireland's Son were also published in 1916. As was now the virtual template for all his published work, this book contained a mix of clean, expressive linear renders interspersed with atmospheric colour page inserts. A year later, Pogány indulged his obvious interest in classic fantasy literature with his interpretation of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. And although there were also some line-only illustrations, the great majority of images in this volume were painted and reproduced in full colour throughout. His work by this point was a truly international success, and the books he illustrated sold in large numbers in both the USA and Europe, and there was no letting up of the remarkable levels of his creative productivity. In 1918, Pogány worked with Padraic Colum again on a retelling of the adventures of Odysseus, for which he produced a collection of plausibly neoclassical formal line illustrations. But the days of the lavishly produced gift book was clearly over, and the book couldn't hope to be as visually impressive as his pre-war output. For the next few years he also designed scenery and costumes for various productions at the Metropolitan Opera, and in 1921 Pogány became a naturalised American citizen. He continued to occasionally create magazine covers and press advertising, and in 1922 he collaborated again with Padraic Colum on The Children of Odin. This was another particularly sparse but expressive monochrome line-only collection of Nordic mythical imagery. In the same year he unveiled his murals for the August Heckscher Children's Theatre, showing various iconic fairy tale characters lining the walls and flanking the stage. The Legend of the Tulip, a collection of children's stories by Isadora Newman, was published in 1926 and featured some attractive but atypically loose watercolour illustrations. And in the same year he returned to classically styled line work with a collection of erotic pen and ink illustrations, with an obvious nod in the direction of Art Nouveau decadent Aubrey Beardsley for the Song of Bilitis written by Pierre Louys in 1894. By the later 1920s he had all but abandoned his earlier tonal watercolour work, and Willy Pogány's Mother Goose in 1928 showed an altogether different approach to image making. It seems he had been influenced by the cultural advance of modernism, also known as Art Deco, or at least had been prepared to adapt to this change in the direction of prevailing fashion. But whether or not this had been a calculated move on his part to stay relevant ultimately made little difference, as both the colour work and the bold black and whites he produced for this volume reveal he was every bit as adept with this as with his earlier, more overtly painted style. Other than the attractive colour end papers he created, his 1929 visualisation of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was entirely black and white, and stylistically appeared rather undecided, with a technique which hovered somewhere between his older and newer visual approaches. The world of advertising still manifestly preferred his watercolour paintings to sell their products, but the two books he had published in 1930, Casanova Jones by Joseph Anthony and Magyar Fairy Tales written by his brother Nandor, remain resolutely monochrome and by his own standards unexceptional. By this point in his career, Pogány was also working as an art director for several Hollywood films, including a couple of Busby Berkeley extravaganzas, Fashions of 1934 and Dames, and his illustration career took somewhat of a nosedive as a consequence. He had divorced his first wife in 1933 and married again in 1934, this time to the writer Elaine Cox. It would be another 2 years before his next significant book illustrations were published in a 1936 edition of Sonnets from the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. These romantic verses brought out the best from Pogány, with a series of emotionally charged watercolours, and among them was this remarkably candid miniature masterpiece which must have seemed fairly risque at the time. And after another 2 years in 1938 he returned to his more folk art naive styling for a very attractive edition of Alexander Pushkin's story The Golden Cockerel, and the brightly coloured results made for an engagingly playful series. In 1939 he collaborated with Elaine, his wife, on the animated short featuring the character Peterkin titled Scrambled Eggs, produced by Walter Lantz. And in the following year a book was published, but rather than re-illustrate for book format, the original cell-painted frames laid over watercolour backgrounds were used, and this produced results some way distant from what they might have been if painted by the man himself. In the mid-40s, Pogány published a trio of books on various aspects of drawing and painting, and they proved popular with many aspiring illustrators who were trying to improve their skills. And at this time he was working regularly for the popular magazine The American Weekly. In 1944 he created a series of Zodiac-themed pin-up girl images, and several other themed colour covers. In 1947 he also produced this cheerfully provocative, but far from vulgar nude for a calendar. Around the turn of the decade his work for the American Weekly featured a particularly popular set of Shakespearean covers, emphasising the bard's female characters. And the series not only showed that he clearly hadn't lost any of his earlier talent for the use of watercolour, or his Hollywood-style flair for romance and glamour. His last published illustrations were for his sister's book The Art of Hungarian Cooking in 1954, and Willy Pogány died in New York City in 1955 when he was 73 years old. Given the dizzying heights he'd attained during his remarkably diverse and prolific career, it's a great pity that Pogány didn't leave the stage on a more creative high point for an epitaph. But even so, most of us would happily settle for just a fraction of his talent and the success he had enjoyed in both creative and financial terms. And I think it's fair to say that the high points he had created along the way more than entitled Pogány to an enduring place among the giants of 20th century illustration.